everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. Welcome to another episode of Zaiqa Chronicles. So before we begin today's session, I want to thank each and every one of you for all the love, support and encouragement we've been receiving from you. और हमें बहुत सारे suggestions भी मिल रहे हैं आपसे कि different topics or different themes that you all want featured in our online session, and we would definitely try to include all of those. जो लोग आज पहली बार हमसे जुड़ रहे हैं उनसे मैं अपना तारुफ करा दूं। मेरा नाम आली है। मैं दिल्ली यूनिवर्सिटी में पिछले 8 साल से हिस्ट्री पढ़ा रही हूँ। Apart from that, I've recently started curating food history events in Delhi, and it's under the name Zaiqa Nama. If this is something that piques your interest, then you can follow us on Instagram and Facebook to know more about the upcoming events. और जायका क्रॉनिकल्स जो है, इसके थ्रू हमारी कोशिश है कि हम तारीख और तहजीब के उन पहलुओं पे गौर करें जो हमारे पॉपुलर इमेजिनेशन और पॉपुलर हिस्टोरिकल नैरेटिव का हिस्सा नहीं है। तो आज हम बात करने वाले हैं शुगर के बारे में। चीनी और शक्कर जो हमारे किचन सप्लाई का एक बहुत ही इम्पोर्टेंट आइटम है। सुबह की जो हमारी चाय होती है, कॉफी होती है जिसमें शक्कर डली होती है, उसके बिना हमारे दिन की शुरुआत नहीं होती। और अगर खाने के बाद अगर मीठा ना हो तो हमारा वो मील और इनफैक्ट वो दिन मुकम्मल नहीं होता। और ऐसे अगर गौर किया जाए तो हमारी जो बोलचाल की भाषा है उसमें भी चीनी, शक्कर और शुगर लफ्ज जो है बहुत ही आम तौर पे इस्तेमाल होता है। कुछ जैसे कि हम कहते हैं कि कोई बात अच्छी लगे तो हम कहने लगते हैं कि तुम्हारे मुंह में घी शक्कर, या कोई शुभ काम करने से पहले वो मुंह मीठा करने वाली रस्म, या कुछ अच्छा लगे तो कहना कि शॉर्ट एंड स्वीट। तो the history of sugar is actually anything but short and sweet, and we'll try and talk about some aspects of it. So without much ado, let me welcome our guest, Dr. Anirban. Anirban, are you on the screen? Hi.
Yes. I'm firmly on the screen. Thank you so much, Ali. Thanks for asking me to talk. And let me warn you right at the beginning that I'm slightly nervous.
That makes the two of us. These live sessions have a grammar of their own. Anyway, तो मैं अनिर्बान का इंट्रोडक्शन आपसे करा देती हूँ। वैसे खैर आपने पोस्टर्स में उनका इंट्रोडक्शन तो पढ़ा ही होगा। वो कर्नावती यूनिवर्सिटी में हिस्ट्री पढ़ाते हैं और एक बहुत ही अच्छा कोर्स फूड हिस्ट्री का उन्होंने क्यूरेट किया है जो उन्होंने अवेलेबल कराया वहाँ के स्टूडेंट्स को। और हम एमए में साथ में थे और लेकिन काफी साल तक बातचीत नहीं हुई। इसके बाद फिर वो खाने और फूड हिस्ट्री के सिलसिले से फिर हमारी वापस बात होनी शुरू हो गई। एंड हियर वी आर अगेन टॉकिंग अबाउट द हिस्ट्रीज ऑफ शुगर, राइट? सो Anirban, the first thing I want to ask you is, how did you get interested in food history? Because I know your primary research work is on caste and gender.
Caste primarily, but look, I started teaching and I was teaching the regular UGC-based courses for UG students. And here we have a 4-year UG system for history major. So I had to offer a number of new courses for this 4th-year students. I started thinking about them because UGC generally offers you the guidelines for the first 3 years courses, and you're supposed to follow all those guidelines. Now, when I started thinking about the courses to offer for the 4th-year students, I thought of issues about common people and the histories that they can touch or feel. Indeed, that impacts them in their everyday life and that they connect or respond to in an emotional kind of way. So I've had courses on sports and clothes history. I've had courses on film history, on food history. This year I'm doing a course on public history and oral history and so forth. So students were also keen and they responded quite strongly to some of these courses and their content. For instance, in the food history course, the first couple of classes, we spoke only about memories of food. What is it that they remember touching and indeed sustainable, memorable about their favorite food? And I came across some wonderful, wonderful stories about pizza. In fact, you have to remember that I and you also teach millennials. So pizza and khichdi, another very interesting experience and story that I came up. And of course, I, being a bong, spoke about my simple rice and fish and that sort of thing. And the kind of literally physical uh, peace and contentment that this kind of eating and experiences gave us. Um, the basic question I was asking them is very simple. Why is it that something is your favorite food, something to which you keep going back, especially when you're not feeling very well or happy? And they
Right.
said it is largely about the memory of a special day when those events or food items lifted their moods. They were not feeling good, perhaps, and they
Mm-hmm.
had those foods. So I also understood in a very intuitive, interactive sort of a way that food stokes memories and very
Right.
warm memories. So that is how I kind of got interested in food. Of course, there's a prehistory. In 2015, soon after my PhD, I reviewed a book on culinary culture in colonial India
Mm-hmm.
by a very distinguished historian, Professor Utsa Roy, who teaches in Jadavpur University. Now, Utsa did a wonderful book on the changes in culinary practices among South Asian middle classes, focusing on the Bengali middle classes, changes in say late 19th and primarily early 20th century, the coming of the recipe books and so on. I was intrigued by a kind of absence in that work. It's a terrific book. You know, it was a book about Bengali middle classes, and it had very little really about fish or Rasgulla and things like that. That made me think about other kinds of possibilities in food history. So clearly, food history that develops inside the mainstream academia has its terrific, terrific merits. But there are ways in which food also creates distinctive sociabilities, identities that stay outside the realm of reason and logic of
Right.
research.
Right. Right.
So these are some of the questions that got me interested in reading up,
Right.
and it kind of took on a life of its own since then.
Right. Hello, Farhana. Hello, Lily. Thank you for joining us. So, Lily Swan has actually authored a book on which is called History on My Plate, which has been a bestseller. And thank you so much for joining us. Um, तो हम अपने मुद्दे पे आ जाते हैं. We were going to talk about sugar. So, can you tell us a little bit about the background? Because sugar, I find is such a common ingredient in our kitchen, but the threads that tie us to such I don't know what to say, interesting maybe is not the word, but probably a very dark past we've had as far as sugar is concerned, from being something which is from a rare commodity and turning into an everyday ingredient in all our kitchens. There has been a very, very long history, and this history is not short and sweet, like I said in my introduction. So can you just let's just begin with talking a little bit about the background to sugar and just like.
Well, in short, there's a huge, long prehistory of the discovery of sugar. Of course, it
Mhm.
was discovered probably 400 or so generations ago, maybe 450 generations ago, in
Mhm.
what is New Guinea today, in the equatorial New Guinea. Complicated story. At some point, apparently, the second major place was where sugar had a footprint was probably India. But these details I do not fully understand. These are complicated botanical debates. They kind
Right.
of extract uh, original traces of sugar from hybrid sugars and so forth. It made little sense to me, and I don't fully understand those intricate details. But sugar really remained a very, what you call, elite consumption centric commodity, and
Right.
ordinary people anywhere in the world probably were not familiar with regular consumption of sugar until 18th century and 19th century in a large enough manner, when sugar factories and sugar processing came up, especially throughout the plantation economy
Mhm.
in the New World, South
Right.
America, on the back of slave labor. But
Right.
what struck me even more is how, in some ways, several of these plantation products indirectly were boosting the economy of the colonies, in this
Mhm.
case England, but also it, sugar and tea, for instance, coffee, cocoa, rum, molasses, all of those not only were new economy commodities, but also they enforced, eventually, of course, over a period of time, a change in the pattern of consumption in the lower middle classes and became a mass product. Now,
Right.
this is one of the biggest mysteries. The logic of colonialism, as we had studied for so many years, emphasizes the aspect of exploitation.
Mhm.
It also emphasizes the aspect of uneven trade practices. It emphasizes the aspect of impoverishment of the plantation economies, immiserization of labors, and
Mhm.
generally um, remains production centric, labor centric.
Right.
But I started reading, and indeed, I've not read the whole overview of Sidney Mintz, but his Sweetness and Power, and later his Tasting Freedom, Tasting Food, gave me a perspective about how the consumption practices of poor people,
Mhm.
middle class people, and indeed lower middle class, poorer sort of laborers in the home countries, in the colonies,
Mhm.
changed in terms of adaptation of sugar to their daily diets.
Right.
Now, here you do not have a simple contradiction between capitalists, colonizers, monsters, villains, huge systems, and
Mhm.
on the other hand, a group of helpless, hapless, weak, very small, minor group of people called cultivators and slaves. So
Mhm.
far, that's how we had read the story. The part
Right.
that kind of tempted me to know more is how, over time, our consumption practices change, and a kind of cash crop or commodity eventually becomes part of the life of the poor people, as a matter of fact, in the colonies, because it had always been a luxury product, and the elite would have anyway made enough money to have access to the sugar.
Yeah. It's
So the
always
story of
to me that that something which was such a rare commodity ultimately becomes so commonplace, and in the 18th and the 19th century, the poor are majorly, this is such a major part of their diet, and that was such an easy way to give them, fuel them with that many calories without any nutritional benefits, right? It suited the empire in that way. The whole of industrial revolution was probably manned by these people who were just chugging these very sugary treats and sugar and tea and all of that, and they were not getting any. So this is very interesting for me to see, from something which was very very rare to something which almost made industrial revolution or the logic of it possible in a way, because you fed them, you just give them tea and sugar and you fed them for a little while, and there are no nutrient benefits for it, and they can go on for a day working for you in the factories. So I just
um,
want to go back a little bit, and I just want to, one question that always interested me, that we know of sugar in Ayurveda, it was called shakara, We know of it in the Gupta period and all. Why is it that sugar came to be known as chini? Have you read some?
I really do not have a very good answer to that. I would have to look into the relevant literature. What I
Right.
do know, however, is over a period of time, and this is, a sort of guesswork,
Mm-hmm.
in Indian culture and society, sugar also gets associated with a certain kind of auspiciousness.
Right.
I have no idea how it becomes so intimately associated with auspiciousness, but remains largely out of bounds from the common people. Also, remember this: what we are talking about is sweetness and sweeteners, not
Mhm.
necessarily mass produced sugars, which
Right.
happens many, many years later. In
Right.
fact, throughout the 19th century, you had molasses and sugarcane, of course, but largely the trading happened in terms of gur.
Mm-hmm.
So, chini or shakkar probably remained a fairly marginal commodity. Gur
Right.
was a far more familiar sweetener that was sort of served to the palates of Indians of all varieties. And you
Right.
had very useful and efficient small scale trading networks.
Yeah.
In fact, there were castes specifically of people who made sweetmeats, but sugar on a large enough scale came to replace gold. Um, in fact, as late as the early 20th century, with the coming of sugar mills. That
Right.
is a fascinating story, which
The sorry, a
Shahid
crystallized
Amin
sugar.
has.
Crystallized sugar was known to us, but must be in a very, very small quantity. And it was the
Yes,
Egyptians
yes.
who really, were masters in making that white sugar, because there are references of white sugar in the medieval literature. But what you're telling us about it becoming part of our everyday diet, as and in terms of the middle class and the poor, that is a fascinating theme to really explore.
That's what kind of got me interested into this. Sugar is indeed a highly researched theme. In
Mm-hmm.
India itself, you've had this book by Shahid Amin on
Mm-hmm.
sugar and sugarcane in Gorakhpur.
Right.
But as I said, that book is only using sugar as a point of departure, but it comes as part of a generation of very interesting books on economic history.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, what he was really looking at is relationship of production with regard to sugar and sugarcane factories. What
Right.
are the ways in which the small peasant farming in eastern Uttar Pradesh responded to the challenge of capitalist modernization or
Mm-hmm.
modernity, if you
Mm-hmm.
like? What are the ways in which sugar cultivation and production and processing in India under British colonial rule was different from, say, practices in the plantations in the Caribbean?
Mm-hmm.
And he comes up with some very interesting nuggets. But what also interested me is how short, really, this kind of change took for them to take place.
Mm-hmm.
You would not believe it, but most of Gorakhpur sugar mills were established in a span of 5 years. Close to 100 plus
Mm-hmm.
sugar mills were established in the wider Gorakhpur area between 1931, 32 really, and 1937. So
Mm-hmm.
while you have the global recession and depression elsewhere, in Gorakhpur you have the flourishing of sugar mills on account of the withdrawal of a tariff barrier and
Right.
introduction of a number of encouraging policies. And you literally have the economy and the production relations of an entire region, linguistic and cultural region, changed overnight. And also, he speaks about the ways in which the capitalists, or these words are kind of formidable and intimidating. Let's call them owners of sugar mills, um,
Mm-hmm.
approached these new kind of crop and intensification in cultivation and prospecting sugarcane. Um, and it seemed as though instead of, and this is a familiar theme, and we were taught this as college students, and later these were confirmed. It seemed as though the traditional landlords and money lenders were already very entrenched in the sugar economy. Sugar cultivation was not new in Gorakhpur. Even before 1930s, Gorakhpur produced a great deal of sugar, but that was managed largely by the local traders, money lenders, and the landlords. And it
Mm-hmm.
seemed for a moment that these sort of surge of capital and factories would change that dynamic of relation
Mm-hmm.
between the producers and the purchasers, the marketers, for a moment, that there would be direct communication, as a matter of fact, between the growers and the millers. These were the terms which were used. And they spoke as if it would happen, but it did not. And that's the story that he writes, because why that happened is, of course, a long story, and we can take that up. But
Mm-hmm.
that's the long and short of the India story. In India, sugar is written off. The history of sugarcane and sugar is written off in the 80s as part of a collection of economic histories which primarily seek to explain why the capitalist transformation did
Mm-hmm.
not quite take place in the Indian agriculture, or the agricultural sector, or agro processing sector. That's
Right.
how historians had approached the question. I haven't really seen if this is followed up with more consumption oriented kind of. And Amin himself has moved on. He's done wonderful works on peasants and memories, and indeed peasant lives. But
Mm-hmm.
sugar, he did not really return to in a big way
I
since
think
then.
India is also connected to sugar in the way that, there was slavery, and after the abolition of slavery, there was indentured laborers. So many of them went from India, and they went to all of these, these islands, and where they were indentured laborers. So there is this, we have this dark connection with sugar becoming this commonplace commodity that it is also, right?
It is, and it's also a very from the very beginning, Ali, sugar was in some way connected, as historians use the term, always already globally networked.
Right, right.
Mints write in detail about
Actually,
how
the pursuit of this taste of sweetness actually propelled this taking over of territories and honing these technologies, and literally capturing people and making them work in these plantations. So it's the more I study colonial history, the more I realize that it was all about food, really. I mean, we have different kind of entry points, and we try to study it in terms of raw materials market. But wasn't it really about food? Right down from spices to teas to sugar to everything. It was about food, I think, majorly.
you kind of offer me a wonderful entry point to some of the essential questions that Sidney Mintz had set out to explore. He is easily, in some way, the most distinguished anthropologist on food, or in any case, a pioneering
Mm-hmm.
anthropologist on food. He taught in Yale for a long time, and then set up anthropology school at Johns Hopkins. And he wrote at length about the connection between what he calls sweetness and power. And he uses the word power in several senses, several layers, really, not necessarily in a post colonial Foucauldian sort of a manner, but he kind of specifies them. He says, for instance, there are several manifestations or forms of power. And you have to remember that I'm talking about someone whose prime works were published in the 70s and 80s and who worked until the 90s.
Right.
And before the so-called post-colonial turn swept the South Asian academia.
Right.
He identified these modes of power, forms of power that I think will be very helpful for younger students to follow. One is, of course, akin to something like charisma. An
Right.
individual appears in such a way that he sort of mesmerizes the audience by his delivery, by his words, by his appearance, and so on. Then there is the power of persuasiveness. You speak in such a way that you appear friendly. The third and fourth kind of power is, in fact, systemic, or what they call strategic sort of power, where people get to influence from a distance other people's behaviors and conducts. In a fourth sense, which you can think of this as a kind of concentric circle of increasing authority and increasingly invisible authority. In a fourth sort of layer, power is the capacity to indeed design systems and how people behave or get to behave in a cultural sense. And he shifted his focus, and that connects the earlier phase of his work to the later phase. Initially, he spoke about plantation economies, colonialism as a system which brought and indeed wrought deep and fundamental changes in the life cycles of people. But at another level, it also changed deep-rooted cultural habits of diet and eating practices among people. And he used terms like inside and outside power. Now, outside power happens in terms of the large forces, political, economic, and social, huge influences which motivate or force or inspire people in outward sort of a manner. For instance, your schedule in office in some way conditions when you are likely to eat your lunch or breakfast or dinner. And that kind of schedule is connected with or determined by larger forces beyond your control. It has to do with factory authorities, larger international capitalists, investors, and so on. At that level, the small man is really powerless. But then there are inside power dynamics where it also influences what you can eat and how much you can eat. The story of breakfast cereals, for instance, is a fascinating example of that.
Yeah, it is.
You know the story of breakfast cereals, and sugar and
Please,
sweeteners
please.
are indeed a major part of that story. People did not think about eating a wholesome breakfast until about 1940s, or did not think of breakfast as a wholesome meal until Kellogg's came up with a series of advertisements in the 1940s. So Mintz beautifully connects stories of power by colonial forces, colonial powers literally, with the more contemporary scenario where your food habits can literally be dictated by, let's say, multinational companies, which advises you on your health. And
Right.
you know the story of diet, how it came about, right? um,
Right.
uh, Through the experiments of a professor in an American university in the 1890s with rats inside cages, being fed after regular intervals, which
Mhm.
eventually is taken up by the army.
Right.
So mints kind of opens up many of these possibilities. And sugar here is a connection between both colonialism as a form of exploitation and today are concerns about diet, health, intake, perception, and so on in a
Right.
very globalized sort of a manner.
Right. The site of food was so important for colonialism. This is where they also established their hierarchy in terms of, the cultural hierarchy, that is the superiority that they had. And we have a lot of these Indians initially, trying to ape that lifestyle. It was all about because it was such a big aspect, cultural aspect of being civilized. Okay. And then on the other hand, you have this other reaction where people started having this national consciousness, and there was a rejection of the same, and there was, people trying to imagine nation and India and community through food. That's this is something that Utsa Ray writes about, and I
This is
find it absolutely
precisely what her book is all about. And let me give you a story from today's newspaper. I sent you this before. I was thinking about some of these contemporary questions, and then
right.
suddenly internet suggested, AI and things like that. Probably internet had a clue that you and I are going to talk about sugar this evening. So I come upon this Hindustan Times piece where someone called Chinmay Damle
Right.
writes about a very strange sort of local event where you have an Italian pastry maker settling down in Pune in
Mm-hmm.
the early 20th century, late 19th and early 20th century,
Mm-hmm.
and Indian students going to this Italian pastry maker
Mm-hmm.
being portrayed as some sort of anti-national.
Mm-hmm.
Anti-national is of course a contemporary term, but
Right.
eating Italian dessert in early 20th century Pune would be considered violative of native food customs,
Okay.
hypothetically, ethically speaking. So this new generation young men, of course, women were still some years away from appearing rebels. That would happen in 1960s, probably in a large enough scale. So
Mm-hmm.
now in local Marathi journals,
Mm-hmm.
Damle finds references to novels and short stories where
Mm-hmm.
men going to the shop by Mordechai or Morechao, that Italian, is spoken of as transgressors.
Right.
So, yes, the question of community being forged is intimately connected with food. And if you remember Utsa's thesis,
Right.
the middle classes walked out a very interesting strategy
Mm-hmm.
to internalize these changes. So, on the one hand, they were faced with European food and a very wide range of choice
Mm-hmm.
and temptations. On the other hand, the first generations of Indian young men in
Mm-hmm.
1830s and 40s Calcutta were also discarded by society as terrible rebels, enfant terribles, the Derosians and so on, because they ate forbidden food or
Mm-hmm.
Christian food and so on. So the middle classes by the late 19th century and early 20th century had become wiser.
Mm-hmm.
um, they would then create a kind of cultural mediation. They would sometimes offer blend some of these European dishes with Indian spices
Right.
and create an altogether new form of taste.
Mm-hmm.
And in creation of that new Indian or new Bengali or new national kind of cuisine,
Mm-hmm.
they create a new self where they navigate two apparently contradictory worlds, where
Right.
on the one hand they approach and delight in consuming foreign articles, hypothetically speaking, but
Mm-hmm.
also coming up to speak about them as if it's part of their natural diet. The story of biscuit, in fact, Utsa suggests, is a very successful example of
Right.
that sort of a strategy.
Yeah, in fact, okay, before we delve into another section of this, those of you who are watching us, please comment, please ask us questions, please interact with us. अपनी मौजूदगी का एहसास कराते रहिए ताकि हमें भी लगे कि हम सबके साथ बात कर रहे हैं यहाँ पे मिलजुल के एक सेशन कर रहे हैं, right? Okay, back to what we were talking about biscuits. Yeah, that bit was really fascinating. How there were people, the social religious reforms that were going on that time, and biscuits were considered so very foreign at the time that people would actually partake in consuming that just to kind of demonstrate that they're breaking away from the orthodox and the breaking away from the in fact, Bipin Chandra Pal has a lot of these memoirs. The food has such an important role, like he's written about food so much in that, where he talks about his memory of getting beaten up at home because he tried to consume biscuits and he tried to have lemonade and how he would try and hide it from Bipin Chandra Pal. I'm sure everybody knows he was such a famous nationalist. Lal Bal Pal, he was part of that trio. So he has his memoirs and a lot of things to say about food. And then how Swadeshi movement, a Parle Ji and all these biscuits, which are such an important part of us being Indians. Even, Veer does when he does a stand-up comedy act on Netflix, he talks about Parle Ji because, Parle Ji ko wo chini wali chai mein duba ke khana is such an Indian thing to do. You can't replace that flavor. But that they got defined as Indian during the Swadeshi period, and they became Indian. Initially, they were termed as some of these biscuits that were being produced by indigenous industries during the Swadeshi period. They were being called Hindu biscuits, Desi biscuits, or something like that. And then Parle it went on to have the kind of success that it did. Okay, because we were talking about sugar and we got into this whole dynamics of power and cuisine, can we just take a step back and talk about how sugar, we talk about globalization now, and we talk about how these networks and these trade networks and how we are affected by what's happening in other countries now. But when we talk about the history of sugar, from where it was first found, 8,000 years ago, to how it traveled to India, then it makes its way to China, and then it is, by some errant trader, it finds its way into the Middle East, and the Crusades happen, and the Western Europe discovers it, and then, such a fascinating history. So let's just talk a little bit about that, because a lot of our
The part is, just as sugar sort of, and as you just said, sugar reaches Europe much later than, and it's a strange sort of a journey. But for the religious factor, and sugar once again is deeply connected to religious practices. One of the early or in fact in every civilization, the offerings being made to the goddesses, the divine figures, would be
right,
sugar.
right.
But I was frankly much more interested in the history of the last 200 or so years, um,
Mm-hmm.
probably because of our own schooling of thinking things in a large enough scale and to the lives of people who kind of dealt
Truly
with
enough,
sugar as an issue.
sorry, I'm interrupting you. Truly enough, our present eating pattern, our palate and our cuisines are truly defined because of the colonial socio-economic conditions, it is because of them. So yeah, majorly we have to talk about that. And it's so interesting, a lot of things, the point that you started off with earlier, what is the food that you turn to, that you consider like very individualistic in terms of your preference, or something which is made in your household or maybe your community, is something, it's just a matter of how ingredients reach your area, at what cost, how it is made available, how much cheaper, what is being procured. I don't think earlier we even had things like broccoli and mushrooms like available, but they're truly like now sold in
Forget,
our Friday
forget
heart.
earlier. Forget earlier. Even when we were in school, you would not have this easy access to most of these exotic vegetables. So that was not
And the
too long ago.
broccoli is actually become very commonplace now. It must have been exotic at one point, but it's not anymore. And the fact that I have seen, like, there are these Friday markets in most cities, like your colony would have I have seen pastas being sold in boris. That's such a fascinating thing for me to see, the pasta is being sold like that. And I remember when I was reading up on food history, I know it was one of the most sought after items in the 19th and the 20th century. The production was really limited. A lot of it would be brought on from abroad. At some point, the indigenous industries, like the locals, started producing it to serve it to, the Europeans who were living in India. But this remained a bastion of the elite for so long. And now macaroni is something being sold in boris and normal Friday hearts. I find it absolutely fascinating, how these things become aspirational at one point and then they become like common.
That's the kind of stage that I wanted a little bit. In fact, again, that brings me back to Sydney Mints. The question of aspiration is very intimately linked to food, especially with sugar. Consider how we ourselves had sugar, our families, over the last 30 years.
Right.
Initially when we were kids, we would
Mm-hmm.
have sugar
Mm-hmm.
brought over from the local grocery store.
Right.
Over the last 10, 15 years at most, we have refined sugar.
Mm-hmm.
We weigh calories. We also weigh benefits, and we have sugar free. Not because you are otherwise deficient in terms of your sugar intake, but because you mind your health. So here there is a commodity which started off as an aspiration product along
Right.
with tea, and that element of aspiration has indeed remained intimately connected throughout these times. What happened is you've had initially milk and sugar associated with tea, uh, because that was how the British colonial officials took it.
I
And
think I read somewhere it was because they used to have the liquor. It used to be very expensive, and then to make it kind of like popular, the milk and the tea, the sugar started being introduced, and that's how it became widely popular. That it is. It took over all over Europe, and these cafes started happening. The tea houses started happening. The addition of sugar made all the difference. Earlier, it was such an exotic thing and an acquired taste, but suddenly with the addition of sugar, I think everyone's kind of seemed to liked it. That's what, Um,
several reasons, really. One is a certain kind of, and this is not a very strong reason, the natural human disposition towards sugar,
right.
which really cannot be explained. Another is, even at the minuscule level, a degree of nutritional gain. Also, in certain cases, a very strong dose of cultural propaganda where
Mm-hmm.
sugar is spoken of as, and that past history of conspicuous consumption.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Also, at another level, sugar became part of a culture of consumption where it gave people especially laboring people, lower middle class, and aspiring middle classes, a
Right.
degree of having, a degree of feeling of having arrived. The aspirational element that you're talking about, the cafes, um, also the salons, the conversations,
Right.
and also, mind you, it was not only among the middle classes or the lower middle classes, but also among the laboring population, the conversations during a tea break, a new
Hmm.
kind of sociability, which informs people where they share details of their everyday lives,
Right.
especially among men.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, sugar does not do it all by itself.
Mm-hmm.
Sugar really is part of a collection of what I may call four friends. Although I don't know if I can use terms like friends here. Let's say they arrived together:
Right.
tobacco, coffee, and tea. So, in some way, and this is my guess, and Mintz and others have, observed in passing, there needs to be a research also on the degree to which um, the stimulant in tea, coffee, or tobacco
Right.
aided the consumption of sugar, as both, or literally gave people a high.
Right.
So,
We are biologically wired. We can't do without sugar and salt. And it is no wonder that these two commodities have been so sought after, that they were so expensive at one point. And sugar is associated with such a sense of comfort that I did an event on partition. I was looking at changes in food cultures of Delhi because of partition, and I came across this particular halwa, which is bread halwa. You know, refugees who have nothing to them, in their ration they would get bread. So they would break it down with ghee they would have and some sugar, and they would turn it into halwa, because that was the only thing they would celebrate their Diwali or a Guru Parv. So the point that you were making earlier about how it is, anything that comforts us, to that's associated with what is auspicious, to what is a means of celebration and all of that. So I want to quickly talk about how uh, the food industry now, how it is taken to sugar and introduced it in almost everything that we eat, in order to make it much more palatable, in order to um sell it more to us, and how it has become such a health hazard from a time where we did not have enough, to now that we have so much that we have to now go into sugar free and avoiding sugar, to going on these carb free diets. I think world is going crazy, absolutely.
yeah, I think it's, again, to use slightly cliched word, the
Mm-hmm.
larger agro processing companies, and indeed I think this is connected once again with the cultural, a major cultural reorientation, and let's say the arrival of the confectionery industry in a major fashion. Let's give another example from our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, you and I were born at just about the time when birthday celebration with a cake
Right.
was becoming the norm. Uh, Even in our parents' generation or in our grandparents' generation, a birthday would typically be celebrated with a confectionery dish such as payasam and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
I think this entire cultural association with celebration of birth, of marriage, of
Right.
any beginning for that matter, with cutting a cake, um, I should really look into the beginning of it. I'm sure it goes right up to the beginning of Christianity, cakes and ale, really.
Mm-hmm.
But to try and capitalize on certain religious, provisions of religion across, indeed, traditions, Hindu or Christianity, is
Mm-hmm.
an ingenious quality of entrepreneurs. So,
Mm-hmm.
how do you translate let's say, a religious, what's the word I'm looking for, observance, or to a
Mm-hmm.
certain extent, religious requirement,
Right.
sacrament, for instance,
Mm.
um, to a mode of celebration.
Right.
All of these transitions happen, I suppose, during the last 300 or so years. And
Right.
at the same time, it also, these changes and accommodations being made for, and this is a very new and 21st century development, perhaps
Mm-hmm.
20th century, of
Mm-hmm.
home baking, home cooking. And we've had experiences of this over the last 1 year in particular during the
Right.
lockdown. On the one hand, you have huge multinational companies making chocolates,
Mm-hmm.
branded chocolates. On the other, you have people, so many of our friends and colleagues have taken to making chocolates and desserts and other home cooking, sort of. It
Guilty.
also,
Yes.
in a sense, empowers, Ali.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it probably imprisons. So it's the nature of sugar, bitter and sweet in some ways, that
Right.
excites all of us one way or another.
Right. So for Hannah, one of our viewers, she has a questions. Perhaps you could share with us. You were talking about circles of power. So have there been any attempts at breaking these circles of power where they do not serve a purpose anymore? I mean, can you share? Have you come across any instance where people have tried to move away or break away from these circles of power as far as consumption of food is concerned?
Look, there are so many examples, but one of the most glaring examples is in right in front of us, though not with regard to sugar, but with regard to salt.
Right.
And I do not really have to elaborate on do I? So we're talking about colonialism, we're talking about extraction, we're talking about colonial power and
Right.
authority. Um, and I was not hoping to bring in Gandhi in a discussion on sugar or food,
Right.
but
Right.
this question sort of offers me a wonderful opening in with which to sort of enter into a very familiar territory. And I'm sure Farhana would be too well read for me to repeat the question of the salt satyagraha and so on. I am also looking at, and others have looked at, have really read about so many instances of, in plantation, new economy, a new world, people trying to rebel did not more often. Haiti, of course, is an exception,
Mm.
which had staged a rebellion as early as the 18th century, 19th century. But that did not, of course, lead to a great deal of freedom. But in case of food and rebellious or protest politics, the greatest example I can offer, and anyone can, is Salt and Gandhi in India, which I
Right.
think was the staple, if I may use that word as a pun,
Mm.
of our school, college, and university texts on South Asian nationalism. So, this, I suppose, is kind of partly a response to what she asks. And
Right.
and Vipan and others, so many others have written about the logic of salt being so powerful, precisely because it had entered the home of the poorest Indian. And one of the
Right.
reasons Gandhi was so
I find
successful.
it I find it very fascinating. The word salary has something to do with salt and from the Roman Empire.
I had heard too, indeed.
Yeah.
And the point that you talk about eating the salt of your master,
Right.
namak
Or being
khao, and
worthless
so
salt.
on
Somebody
in
being
Hindi.
worthless salt. These expressions, they come in from, from historical experience of certain kind, which are so common space. So I mean, I've read that in during the medieval period, your host who's of a considerable stature, there would be table salt, and then his position, the way he'll be seated, would be above the salt. and everybody is going to be seated around the table according to their status, and it has to do with the level of salt. And
It's also fascinating, Ali, how uh, these commodities, spices,
right,
sugar, and salt, carry out an extraordinary journey over
right.
time in which they emerge as highly elite, exclusive, aspirational product
There used to be these
to
sugar decorative items that used to be like flaunted. So imagine when sugar is being called white gold, you have people making 6 feet tall sugar figures, which are not for consumption, they're just for display. Like how people would buy these expensive cars, like a Maserati or a Audi or something like that. That's the kind of display people would do. And a lot of times, like not for salt. Salt is something that we need on a very, very physiological level, like our body demands it. But how pepper and sugar, all of them started out, even cocoa for that matter, started out as medicinal. Sparsely used in our diet and administered by hakims and doctors. And then comes colonialism and this greed for earning so much money, and then there it is, stocked in
um,
our kitchen
let me give
cabinet.
you another very familiar example of how some of these medicinal products or ostensibly medicinal products over time becomes a staple, even aspirational products, signifying or encouraging a quality of youthful energy.
Right.
Take Coca-Cola.
Mhm.
Coca-Cola debuted as initially a medicinal product as
Mhm.
and when it came up.
Mhm.
And until about the Second World War, Coca-Cola, and it's connected with sugar in a sort of tacit understanding. Um, okay, Second World War and American soldiers is a story in itself. So this is for the first time you have a government offering you a very steady supply of diet
Right.
as necessary for the maintenance of soldiers. And that kind of
Mhm.
experiment I had briefly hinted at started from 1920s. What is a
Right.
good enough diet for soldiers? So meat, for instance, became a staple of soldiers. 6 times a day, meat would be served to soldiers.
Right.
They were not used to eat so much meat before that, as a matter of
And
fact.
that's our
Um,
idea of affluence, that ultimately
yes,
got associated with the
but
idea of
but
affluence.
but all of this, however, was part of a ration by the American government to its
Right.
soldiers, not
Yeah.
Coca-Cola. Something even more fantastic happens with Coca-Cola. American government was not buying Coca-Cola directly from the company and supplying it to the soldiers. But
Mhm.
at the time, one of the big shots, I forget the name of the army, who sort of wrote or took these decisions, came from the South.
Right.
The South was quite hospitable to Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola was quite famous even before the Second World War in South in America, as in southern part of USA. But it had hardly become an international drink. It
Mhm.
was available in some countries outside America, but it had not yet become an international drink.
Right.
So America takes part in the Second World War, and the theater, practically war theater, expands to the whole of the world, almost literally. So
Right.
Coca-Cola signs exclusive deals with the American army. It sets up bottling plants in Asia, in Africa, and in Europe. Overall, 70 plus bottling plants. Some 150 engineers were fanned out with the American army on various war theaters.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
Coca Cola became eventually familiar to the residents of those countries. And
Right.
since then, Coca Cola takes off its wild, iconic international journey. So,
Right.
how something as aspirational, as youthful, as wildly energetic, peppy, and happy sort of a brand as Coca Cola owes its rise to international fame and status to
Right.
something as ghastly and dreadful as the Second World War.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
food is such an unusual window to so many unanticipated, unpredictable,
No,
what do you call, coincidences.
we started out with sugar, and now we're talking about Coca-Cola, and we spoke about so many, things in between. And this is a typical. I mean, that's what happens with food history. एक चीज की बात करो तो फिर वो it goes in so many direction, and there's so many things to talk about. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you so much, all the viewers who are with us, who commented, who watched us. Thank you so much for being with us. And Anirban, thank you so much for this very, very interesting session. And we're looking
I
forward
had
to
no
having
idea how time passed, really. I had great fun. Thank you so much for letting me, hold forth non-stop. I must have been
It's
terribly
an
boring.
absolute pleasure. And you've just opened up so many windows of conversation. I'm sure, I mean, including me, a lot of our viewers would want to go back and look into a lot of these things that we spoke about today. And I think essentially that's what we're trying to do. There's
Fingers
just so
crossed.
yes. Okay, thank you very much. We'll see you again next week. Take care.
Thank you, and thank you so much.